Hey guys, welcome to CraterMania. I'm your host, the man they call Crater, and I'd like to welcome you all to my 500 Movies in 2025 series. So, for today's episode, it's going to be something a little bit different than what I normally do with the channel and the movies that I talk about on the 500 Movies in 2025. Um, so today, I'm still going to discuss these movies and just kind of talk about what I like about them, things that are memorable about them. But where I'm going to be covering so many movies today, I'm covering two different franchises today, guys. So I'm covering both the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, and of course, since today is June 13th, Friday the 13th, I'm going to be covering the Friday the 13th franchise as well. And it's really cool that it lands on June the 13th because for Friday the 13th fans, you know that the first film, at right in the opening, it shows on screen June 13th, 1980, I believe it is. So that's when the film came out in 1980. And June 13th, which is also known as Jason Voorhees' birthday, as this revealed in the end of the film. Spoiler alert. If you haven't ever seen the Friday the 13th films, especially the original film, why are you here watching this video? But yeah, Betsy Palmer, also known as Pamela Voorhees, does reveal in the end that June 13th is Jason's birthday. So, such a cool way to kind of celebrate the franchise, by doing it here on Jason's birthday. But not just like I said before, not just the Friday the 13th franchise that we're going to be talking about today, but also the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. So I just feel like those two should have went together, in one video, because they just go hand in hand. Those were Freddy and Jason were the two most iconic slasher characters from the 1980s. And it culminated in the year 2003 with the movie Freddy versus Jason, which is one of the movies we're going to be talking about as well today. That will be the last movie we talk about tonight. But like I said, this is going to be a little bit different. I'm not going to just do kind of like standard reviews of each film because it's 18 films altogether we'll be talking about tonight. And if I did like complete, full reviews of each film, this would be like a 4 or 5 hour stream. So I'm just going to kind of like go over the films, kind of briefly tonight, and I'm just going to kind of talk about, how, you know, what they meant to me growing up, and it was how they affected me, how they kind of like helped me grow as a horror fan since I was a kid. I'm going to be talking about kind of the effects that they've had on, just pop culture and just like, merchandise that's out there for these films. Just a lot of different things. So we'll get into that in just a little bit. So I just want to kind of just also cover, as I always do at the beginning of these episodes, this is going to be movies number 218 through 235 of the 500 movies in 2025 series. So I've been looking forward to this, just doing this episode for a while now. And so, yeah, I think this is going to be a lot of fun. So let's go ahead and jump right into it, I guess, starting with the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. And for many people, when you're a young kid and you're just getting into horror, um, it's a very gradual process. Maybe you start with a spooky ghost story, or you work your way up to like a creature feature, and then eventually you get brave enough to kind of check out these slasher icons like Freddy and Jason. So for me, one of my like main introductions to the horror genre was the world of A Nightmare on Elm Street. And this was pretty much thanks to my dad and my brother, who kind of like would make me watch these movies with them and stuff. And like I've talked about that in the past. My dad is really one of the biggest reasons I got into horror movies, because he loves them, and he loves them to this day. And he would just, I think, it was just kind of like a thing with him where he just kind of wanted to, just he thought it was funny if I would get scared while watching these films. So, but it just, like I said in the past, I think it kind of backfired on because I ended up becoming this huge horror fan over the years. But like I said, the world of A Nightmare on Elm Street, it wasn't just a movie series that I discovered, it uh it felt like like a fundamental part, of just the fabric of my childhood. And just all my earliest memories, come from these, either wrestling or horror. And especially, Freddy Krueger with that, famous glove and that striped sweater and that dirty hat of his. I genuinely knew who Freddy Krueger was by the time I was 3 years old. Yes, 3 years old. you know um and if you follow me on anything social media, especially here on YouTube, you'll see that my profile picture for the channel is the same as my other social media accounts. Is That's a picture of me from 1989 when I was 3 years old on Halloween, dressed as Freddy Krueger in one of the old Ben Cooper style Halloween costumes that they used to make back then. um but yeah, like, while, other kids at that age were maybe like, focused on cartoon ma- uh cartoon mascots, and, just or fairy tale villains or whatever, watching Disney movies or something. Um my mind was kind of grappling with, well, I talked about this, but like wrestling was one of the things. But when it came to the horror genre, my mind was kind of grappling with just that concept of this burned man with knives on his fingers, who would, attack you in your dreams. And this wasn't, from watching the movies directly at that age. Of course, thankfully my parents were not that reckless. But just that kind of, his that sheer, presence in pop culture that Freddie was building upon. The name of Freddy Krueger was building upon at that time. He was Freddie was everywhere, in, the mid to late 80s. His image was on T-shirts and comic books. He was featured in like parody sketches, like, I guess, like Saturday Night Live and stuff. He was talked about, amongst, kids, like, well, maybe not like, at my age, but like older kids, like at school and stuff. My brother was 13 years old at the time when I first knew. So he's 10 years older than me. So it was just, it was something that he would talk about around the house. My brother would talk about with his friends or my cousins or whatever. He was just this boogeyman that was elevated to a celebrity status. And even before, I saw, Hedda Langenkamp as Nancy Thompson fighting for her life, in that original film. Freddy Krueger was just this energy, just this a warning, and this kind of fascination that lodged itself, deep into my imagination just growing up. And, this whole early, kind of understanding, of what Freddy was, kind of quickly bloomed into this kind of full blown obsession as I would, get older throughout the years. Again, thanks to my dad and my brother, just, being fans of horror films and stuff, just because I just kind of continued along with me. And, um, when I finally, kind of got old enough to understand what was going on, I would watch these films like almost every year. Like, even, we would rent them on the VHS at the video store, or, they might show them on TV, like we had like HBO and stuff in the past. And then so they would show them on there. Um, just let me tell you, just experiencing the original A Nightmare on Elm Street for the first time was nothing short, of a revelation. So Wes Craven, he really crafted something truly groundbreaking here. He didn't just give us another mass killer, chasing teenagers through the woods. He kind of he tapped into something primal, something, um, universal, just that vulnerability of sleep, just the loss of control that we experience when our minds wander, into that kind of subconscious. Um, the idea that the one place that you should be safe, the the place where you retreat and recover, is where your deepest fears can literally kill you. I mean, that was and still is to this day just a stroke of absolute genius. Um, and the first film, is in my opinion a masterpiece of just atmospheric horror. It's moody, it's genuinely scary. I feel like it's still very genuinely scary to this day, and it builds really a sense of that kind of inescapable dread. You know what I mean? Just the practical effects. While they're perhaps kind of showing their age in some ways nowadays, um, they still have this very tangible quality, that CGI often lacks. Um, and if you look at Tina's death in the film, or Glenn's death, or just all the different, just the iconic scenes, and that's what they are. Everything about this film is iconic, and just all these nightmare visuals that just have been burnt into my brain over the years. But then you look at Freddy himself. In this first film, he's kind of less the one-liner quip and showman, that he would later become. But in this one, he's more of kind of a malevolent, predatory force. Um, and Robert Englund's performance is amazing, is absolutely awesome in this. Just he kind of has that very hunched posture about him in this, and just that very that almost like a guttural voice. It's just like very deep, like very creepy as hell voice, and just the way his eyes kind of like gleam. Just kind of just barely seeing. But beneath his hat, it's terrifying seeing that, especially when you're a kid watching this stuff for the first time you know. And the stuff that he's doing in this film, he's not just killing these kids. He's this psychological terror, just made of flesh, or well, burned flesh. And then you got Heather Langenkamp, who is one of the queens of the slasher genre, one of the absolute queens. Um, and her portrayal as Nancy Thompson is just the perfect counterpoint in this to Robert Englund as Freddy Krueger. She portrays Nancy as very intelligent and resourceful and just very resilient all throughout. Um, she is an absolute final girl for the ages. Just fighting back, using her wits, and just this desperate understanding of that dream world. And I've had some people ask me like, "Hey, Crater, why didn't you talk about Nancy or the Nightmare films when you were doing the Final Girls week?" Because like she is one of the top Final Girls of all time. Well, this was the reason. This video right here is what I was saving this for. Is because I knew that I had this plan. Later in the year, I'm gonna be talking about the Nightmare on Elm Street and the Friday the 13th films, all in one. So I just wanted to save all of this, of my feelings over the years for these films about, or just these characters like Nancy Thompson. So yes, she is absolutely one of the greatest, if not, and well, it's debatable amongst some people. Some think she is the greatest final girl. Some think that Laurie Strode from the Halloween series is the queen of the final girls. But it's all subjective, of course. It's something I can't really chime in on. It's something I'd really have to think about, because that's something I've never really sat and thought about. Who do I think is the queen of the final girls? I really couldn't tell you right now. I would just have to sit and analyze it. Um, but I definitely would say that Nancy Thompson, that character, is definitely up there as one of the, if she's not the top, then she's in the top 3 of final girls of all time. And So getting back to the film, so the first film really set the stage for this franchise. It established the rules, and just kind of unleashed this villain unlike any other. Um, and while Friday the 13th may be my favorite horror franchise of all time, this was the franchise that I was introduced to first, when it comes to horror in the slasher genre. Um, I if I'm not mistaken, if I'm remembering correctly, Freddy Krueger, and the Nightmare on Elm Street films may have been one of the first horror films that I've ever watched, if not the first one. So, um, yeah, I guess Freddy kind of ruined me and made me, develop into the horror fan that I am today. Um, but just this first film, it was the spark that really ignited that franchise and just, um, kind of became this lifelong love affair for myself, so to speak. Um, but following the original film, was such a powerful debut and that was always going to be a challenge. Um, and A Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge, took the series in a decidedly different, kind of often debated direction. Um, and there's some people that are like on the fence with this movie. There's some people that love this movie. There's some people that hate this movie. Um, I'm one of the people that loves A Nightmare on Elm Street 2. And even though it is a very completely, different direction from what the original film was, it almost feels like it exists in its own universe. You know what I mean? Like everything about, Freddy in this movie, the whole story about it is just so different from the original and the sequels that would follow part two. But all of the sequels, after part two, are actually similar to the story from the original film. So I don't know, like, what do you guys think? But personally, I love it. A lot of people, like I said, find it to be a weaker entry. You know, I've always kind of appreciated its very unique, darker energy. Um, it really tackles themes of possession and repression head on. Sometimes kind of less, subtle than the first. Um, but guys, I gotta answer a message real quick. I'll be right back. Just stay right there. It'll take me just 1 minute, and I'll be right back. Okay. All right, sorry about that, guys. So I just had to answer a quick message on Facebook. So after this is over, this live is over, I'll go back and edit that so there's no weird dead air there or anything. But anyway, back to what I was saying. We were talking about Nightmare on Elm Street Part Two. So like I said, this film, it really tackled a lot of themes of dispossession and I think, kind of like repression. Really, you know, just something that was so different from the original film. And Mark Patton, his performance as Jesse in this is just very unsettling at times. And Mark Patton, I've met him, in the past, and he's such a cool guy. Um, but in this film, he plays Jesse, who is this young guy who's battling not just this kind of external boogeyman, but his own demons as well, as a teenager, and just the whole body horror elements are absolutely strong in this in this film. And there's this kind of pervasive sense of unease throughout the whole film. While Freddy is starting to kind of hint at his future personality with a few kind of early one-liners that's seen in this film, he's still this very terrifying entity just trying to break in to the real world. And it feels like a part in the whole like core saga, and it's this very interesting chapter of the franchise. Just a really different nightmare with its own disturbing feel that kind of adds complexity to the mythology of Freddy. um and every family has a black sheep, and I think for a lot of people part two is their black sheep. Now I wouldn't agree with that though. Part five, in my opinion, would be the black sheep of the Nightmare franchise. But I'll get to that in just a little bit. But regardless, even if you do look at part two as the black sheep of the Nightmare franchise, you still love it, because it's part of this whole story, and I feel that same way. Even though Nightmare Five is my least favorite. I mean, I'm not even that crazy about Nightmare Five, to be honest with you. I mean, there are parts of it I like, but I'll get into that in just a little bit. But I still watch it over and over when I watch these movies in the franchise, because it's all a part of this story. Um, but next, after part two, came A Nightmare on Elm Street 3 Dream Warriors, which is my absolute favorite in the series. Um, and, I think a lot of fans would agree with that too. There are a lot of fans that I have spoke with that absolutely love Dream Warriors, and they champion it as well as their favorite Nightmare on Elm Street film, and rightfully so, because it's, in my opinion, and I think a lot of others, it's one of the best sequels, not just in this franchise, but in horror history. Um, this film, brought Wes Craven um, in more of a writing capacity, and then Heather Langenkamp, returns as Nancy as well. So seeing Nancy return, she's now this therapist, kind of specializing in sleep disorders, just to help this new group of these teenagers in this psychiatric hospital, and it just, everything about this is just incredibly satisfying. This is the film where the mythology truly exploded in the franchise. The Dream Warriors concept, just these kids with special abilities within their dreams. It's brilliant to me. I mean, and it leveled the playing field and allowed for this incredibly creative, you know, film with these visually stunning set pieces, based on each of characters' kind of suppressed talents and fears. So my favorite character in this was Kincaid, and Kincaid has some of the best lines in this movie and throughout the whole franchise. Um, and just all the characters here are just phenomenal. Like in this, all the different Dream Warriors, not just Kincaid, but you got Taryn, and Joey and Kristen. With Kristen's ability, to pull people into her dreams. Just all of it was just pure nightmare fuel mixed with these kind of superhero comic book origin story elements. And I think that's why I love Dream Warriors so much, because it kind of took the nightmare, you know, um, the whole Nightmare on Elm Street like concept, and like mixed it with this kind of comic book feel. Um, and you would think, when I say that I would like Nightmare on Elm Street 5 more because of the whole character of Mark, who is obsessed with comics and everything. And that's probably that part where he battles Freddy in Nightmare 5 is probably my favorite part of that movie. But But yeah, it just kind of began here though, like that whole like super power thing within dreams for these teenagers that are battling Freddy. It's just an awesome concept. And I think Dream Warriors is also, arguably the film where Freddy kind of solidified that transition into the darkly comedic icon we know. Like I said, there was some things here and there in Nightmare 2, but Nightmare 3 is really where it begins because there's so many things in this film, and especially incorporated with all the kills in the film that kind of bring that dark humor out of the Freddy character. And while it's still terrifying though. Like his kills became more elaborate starting in Dream Warriors, more theatrical and just kind of laced with all those unforgettable one-liners. If you think of the marionette scene or the TV death or the syringe fingers when he's battling against Taryn, this film found, I think, the perfect balance between genuine scares and just, that morbid humor that became really a hallmark of the series. Um, and just that whole cast is just fantastic. And I'm super excited for Scarefest this year because they're doing a huge Dream Warriors reunion at it. Well, just really a huge Nightmare on Elm Street franchise reunion. I mean, because not only are we going to get like a huge Dream Warriors reunion, but there's um, Mark Patton and Kim Myers from Nightmare 2 is going to be there. They got so many of the original cast from the first film, and of course Robert Englund's going to be there and using all of these films. Um, so it's going to be a hell of a time at Scarefest this year. Um, and like I'm super excited. I'm going to probably go for that Dream Warriors photo op because where it is my favorite film in the series. It's one of my favorite horror films in general, and I can't wait for that. And but just getting back to the movie, like I said, the cast is fantastic in this, and just the practical effects are top notch in Dream Warriors. They still hold up to this day. Some of the best effects in horror I feel with Dream Warriors, and it just felt like a very like a natural evolution of the concept, and expanding the lore in a lot of these exciting ways, and just just really delivering on the promise of fighting back, in the dream world. And it was and remains to this day as a huge high point in the franchise. But moving on now to A Nightmare on Elm Street 4, The Dream Master. Um, with The Dream Master, it kind of brought like this more MTV influence aesthetic to the franchise. This film really doubled down on the creative, the spectacular, the dream kills with Freddy, and just kind of pushing the boundaries of absurdity and imagination with them. Um, and while the returning Dream Warriors that survived from the third film, uh, they meet these kind of quick, gruesome ends, and so they kind of write off those the surviving characters from Dream Warriors very early on in the Dream Master, um, which ends up kind of becoming this kind of common theme in the series. But this film introduces my favorite character, um, is aside from Freddy. So my favorite character aside from Freddy in the entire franchise is played by Lisa Wilcox, and it's the character of Alice Johnson. Um, Alice's journey, you know, she goes through this journey just absorbing all of these dream powers and memories of all of her friends that are getting killed off. And to me, that concept is just so compelling. It really makes her this worthy successor to Nancy Thompson from, the first and third film. Um, so Alice, she becomes the Dream Master in this, and the film itself, the Dream Master, is just this kind of fast paced, you know, vibrant in a horrifying way, and just kind of features, some of the truly memorable nightmare sequences, like the Roach Motel, you know, just and the you want to suck face when he kills Sheila, and just the karate fight with Rick, just Freddy is fully in his element here. The whole wisecracking, theatrical villain, clearly just enjoying his work with all these kids that he's killing in this film. And this film was really what kicked off Freddy Mania in the 80s. This was a massive box office success. And it really cemented Freddy's status as a mainstream uh, cult phenomenon. I mean, like I said, Freddy Mania was running wild after this film came out. But it also it leaned further than what Dream Warriors did into that kind of dark humor. Which I think some purists of the franchise kind of debate that still. But for a fan that was growing up in the 90s. I grew up in all throughout the 90s, but I was born in the late 80s. And just kind of discovering these films as I was from the time I was 3 years old, and I got older, and I would watch these more and more, and got a better understanding of the films. It was just pure dark fun for me, and it really showcased that sheer creative potential of the dream landscape, and just kind of kept that wild energy of the series alive. But next we come to what is my least favorite. I don't even know if I'd even call it a favorite. It's my it's just the one I don't really care for that's in the franchise, and it's Nightmare on Elm Street 5: The Dream Child. Um, and the movie really, I mean, if I want to speak positively about it, I mean it does kind of lean more into the symbolic and psychological territory, where it kind of focuses on Alice's pregnancy and Freddy's attempt to influence her unborn child's dreams to be reborn into the real world. Um, which, I mean, that's an interesting concept, but I really never cared for that. Um, but I guess while perhaps it's not, it's definitely in my opinion not universally loved as part 3 or 4. Um, I mean, there are parts of it that kind of has a very disturbing charm to it. The nightmare sequences are particularly surreal and just often kind of grotesque. And I tell you, that's one of the nightmare sequences that I really hate. It's with Greta when like she's like he Freddy's stuffing all the food into her mouth and stuff. I fucking hate that. It's so gross to me. I don't know what it is. I cannot stand that whole scene. But if you get to like the comic book sequence with Mark, the battle between him and Super Freddy, who was played by Michael Bailey Smith, who will also be at Scarefest this year. Um, it just it that and that was probably my favorite part of the whole movie, the whole comic book sequence. But just this movie, it really kind of delves a bit more into Freddy's past as well, and um, though not perhaps not explicitly, I can't talk tonight, guys. Explicitly as the later films. And Alice, like in part 4, she remains this strong protagonist, fighting not just for herself, but for her child's soul. Um, it's a much darker and weirder entry in this, and I don't care for Freddy's makeup in this one. I think that's one of the things that bothers me the most because it looks so cheap to me for some reason. His makeup in this film is like they didn't put as much effort into it as they did the earlier films. Um, but like I said, this is a very dark, weird entry into the franchise. Um, just explores kind of that lineage and just that kind of inherited trauma, through that lens of the whole nightmare logic. But it did expand, the lore in kind of these very unexpected ways, and just kind of kept that visual inventiveness, going strong. So I will say that about it. But moving on, and this next one is one that I think a lot of people um, don't like at all, and I've heard people absolutely trash this one, um, which is just interesting to me, just because I like this one a hell of a lot more than I like Part Five, and this is Freddy's Dead: The Final Nightmare. So, as the title suggests, at the time anyway, this was intended as a swan song for the whole franchise and just the Freddy Krueger character. So that the film is it leans heavily into dark comedy and absurdity. Um, but it's just so entertaining to me. I think that's why I like it so much, because there are some stuff in this that is just so funny to me and so absurd that like I just can't hate it, because it's just part of my humor. Um, and that same kind of humor is in part five, but just this one just has more of an appeal to me. I don't know. I don't know what it is, guys, but I mean, but it but with this one, it's almost like a live action cartoon at times, and it's very divisive for sure with fans, but I have a huge special place inside of me for it. You know, it really features this very fun cast of these troubled teens, including this young Johnny Depp, who makes a cameo in the film later in the film. And then just the 3D sequences, or the 3D sequences. It's really bad 3D, but they were trying for something here. Um, it just kind of adds that another layer of that, that knowing silliness. Um, and crucially, the film, it does kind of dive more into to Freddy's origins and just showing his life before becoming this dream demon, and his horrific murder, by all the Springwood parents. Um, so while that kind of demystification of the character wasn't universally popular, um, I found it to be really interesting, just kind of see this twisted human monster before he became this supernatural entity. It felt like this kind of grand, goofy, violent farewell, full of in jokes and over the top kills, and just, this weird sense of wrapping things up. Um, it's the wild, anarchic party at the end of the original saga. But, when everyone thought back then, when that film had came out, they thought that was gonna be the end of Freddy. We wasn't gonna see Freddy again. But you can't keep a good, or in this case, bad man down. So just a few years later, Wes Craven would return to the franchise finally, and where he would create Wes Craven's New Nightmare. And this film was a game changer. It's incredibly meta. Uh, I mean, probably like the earliest I could think of in the horror genre, when it comes to having that meta concept, just where it's existing in a world where the Nightmare on Elm Street films are just that. They're films, but that evil entity of Freddy Krueger that is just trying to break through into reality, and he really kind of manifests as this truly terrifying version of Freddy Krueger. So they bring back Heather Langenkamp to play herself in this, and she's dealing with the horror icon that she helped popularize, and to me that's a stroke of genius. Wes Craven was an absolute genius when it came to horror. Um, And New Nightmare is just this smart, very suspenseful, and genuinely scary at times throughout the film. It strips away all those kind of one liners, even though they are kind of still there. Like, you ever play Skin the Cat? So when he's like dragging the babysitter Julie up the wall and everything, like, that's still there, but it's kind of pulling away from that mostly, and it really just kind of presents Freddy as this more ancient, purely evil, and he's grounded in this kind of disturbing reality, which is the reality of the filmmakers and the actors. Um, it's a commentary on horror itself, on the power of stories, because it's shown throughout the film, like everything that they're saying in this movie is a part of this script that Wes Craven dreamed up, and he's written. So, and everything is becoming real from the script, and just that whole difficulty, of just containing evil once it's being unleashed into the public consciousness is all present here. You know, this movie, it felt fresh. Well, when I was a kid when this came out, I was like maybe 8 years old or something, 7 or 8 years old. So I didn't really look at it like that when I first watched it. But as I got older and I watched the film more and more, I realized that it was a very fresh and innovative film at the time, and it just proved that the nightmare concept could be, reinvented in all these compelling ways. It was such a sophisticated return to that form, and just reminded everyone just how terrifying that Freddy could be. You uh, when you're handling with this kind of deadly seriousness. Um, but beyond the films themselves, just the true measure of the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise's impact in is its explosion into pop culture. Freddy Krueger wasn't just this typical movie monster. He became this phenomenon. His burned face, the red and green striped sweater, his fedora, the iconic glove, were all instantly, recognizable globally. I mean, all over the world. Like I said, Freddy Mania was running wild. He really transcended the horror genre and just became, this comedic punchline, this rock star, this marketing machine. I mean, look right here, I have Freddie's greatest hits record. Like, so it's just all these songs um, that were just written about Freddy Krueger. Like, this came out in 1987. So this is around the time when I want to say it was Dream Master, I think, came out that year. And but yeah, just like so much stuff was put out. And just like I said, Freddy Krueger was a marketing machine, just and this whole pop culture dominance, really led to tons of merchandise. Like anything you can really think of, they slapped Freddy Krueger on it. Which, growing up as a kid, and if you're interested in that type of thing, that's pure heaven to you. And I remember as a kid, I would go to the stores, and they would usually have this stuff out like around Halloween time and stuff. And just the stores and like the comic shops, and I would look for anything Elm Street related. Um, there were like these. I think, who made those? They made this doll of this Freddy doll from I had this as a kid where like I don't know if it was kinda like marketing from Nightmare on Elm Street 2 because, like, it had this guy underneath it, just like a normal guy, and it came with, like, all these pieces where you could put the Freddy costume on him and, the Freddy head, so it was like a guy that became Freddy, so I always kinda, like, put that with Nightmare on Elm Street 2 because with the whole story with Jesse and Freddy becoming. Hold on one second, someone is calling me, I apologize again, guys. Sorry, guys, I'm back again. This doesn't usually happen. If you're new to the channel, you're watching this. I apologize. This doesn't usually happen. For some reason, everyone started trying to call me at the same time and sending me messages and stuff on Facebook while I'm doing a stream. But usually, I do my streams later in the night. Um, so I usually don't do them this early. So yeah, maybe that was a bad move on my part. But anyway, back to what I was talking about. Just um, like I said, the Freddy and the whole Nightmare on Elm Street series was just, you know, was this huge phenomenon when it came to merchandise. Um, just like I said, there were model kits. I mean, there were Halloween costumes, masks, lunch boxes, posters, whatever you could think of. Comic books, just regular like novels of Freddy Krueger. Um, and just all of this stuff, really expanded the lore of the franchise and the character. Um, I remember as a kid with the original Nintendo, they put out the Nightmare on Elm Street video game for the NES. And man, that game was really unique in its own sense too. It was just really this side scrolling beat 'em up, game where you collected icons to switch between the real world and the dream world. And I think this was one of the only games for the NES where you could buy this little adapter and hook up four controllers, and four people could play the game at once. If there's any other game on the NES that did that, I don't know of it, but so that was kind of groundbreaking, especially with the Nightmare on Elm Street series is kind of connected to that. So um, I just think that's really cool. It was really innovative, and just it wasn't exactly a good game, especially by today's standards. But it was just really cool to see a Nightmare on Elm Street video game. That was targeted towards kids. Which is and they did the same thing with the Friday the 13th as well. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. But that Nightmare on Elm Street game, it was just another piece of that Freddy history, and just all these products that were just released, and to the ones that are being continued to be released to this day, just really just kind of captures that public imagination to this kind of unprecedented degree. Um, but I did mention costumes, before, like I said, I mentioned this earlier. Um, like my profile picture here on YouTube and all my other social media accounts, that that year in Halloween 1989, where I did have that Freddy costume, and I'm still looking. I would love to have that costume again, just as a part of my collection, um, because that's this. It's so cool to me to look back on that, seeing how young I was and the age I am now, because I turned 39 this year, and just how long that I have been a fan of Freddy, and just just all this the whole horror genre itself is just it's unbelievable sometimes, you know what I mean? Just because Freddy became this absolute just giant of pop culture, um, you know, and just there was no question growing up, you know, that I wanted to be a horror fan, and a lot of that is thanks to Freddy Krueger and Nightmare on Elm Street, and well, mostly thanks to my dad and my brother for for even getting me into that stuff. But yeah, it's just it's crazy just to think about everything that has been put out, everything that has just kind of like appealed to me over the years into making me the fan that I am of this franchise. Freddy Krueger has just earned that place, in some of the most iconic names in pop culture history. And Jason Voorhees is right up there with him. So and those guys will stand, shoulder to shoulder with these other horror icons like Dracula and Frankenstein, and but but Freddy, he possesses that kind of unique quality that sets him apart from all those other characters, and that's with his personality. He talks, he taunts, he evolves. Across the series. He just really embodies, that very specific type of fear, that fear of losing control. Of your mind, turning against you. He's this creation of pure imagination that and that kind of boundless potential, within the dream world that allowed, the series to get away with things that other slashers couldn't. He's quoted, he's parodied, he's recognized by people all over the world who's never even seen a single nightmare film or horror film. That's how big of a mark that Freddy has made on pop culture. But to kind of conclude this up a little bit, because I'm almost going into an hour now, just talking about the nightmare films. Um, this looking back at that whole franchise, just is just as a perspective from a lifelong fan. It's like flipping through a photo album, of this very like cherished, I guess, terrifying memories. And it's ironic because the photo that I talk about, it's my profile picture, is a part of all of like my family's photo albums. Like my mom has a photo album back at her house, with that same picture, with all the other ones of me. And so it's just kind of ironic, just how big of a part of my life that this franchise has become. Um, from all the raw horror of that original film, through just all the inventive dream battles in the series, and that the meta commentary that New Nightmare brought, just that whole sheer cultural explosion of the franchise. These films have left an undeniable mark, not just on the horror genre, but my own personal life. And they just these movies, and it's going to sound really weird and probably stupid to some people, but these they taught me about that power of a unique concept, that brilliance of a truly unforgettable villain like Freddy Krueger, and just that joy, of diving deep into this kind of fantastical, frightening world. Um, and even looking at the entries that might be considered less strong by some, including myself, they're all still pieces of this much larger, fascinating puzzle that is the franchise. They represent that journey of a character and a concept through these shifting landscapes of horror and pop culture, and just that blend of horror and fantasy and dark humor and just sometimes outright absurdity is what makes the series so enduring and rewatchable. And and more than just movies, a Nightmare on Elm Street, the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise created a shared experience, a common language of nightmares and dark jokes, that here within this fan community, this horror community, um, and we still connect over that, decades later. Freddy Krueger isn't just a character in a series of films. He is this cultural fixture, this terrifying friend, I guess you could call it, and just a reminder, that sometimes the most compelling stories are the ones that visit you when you close your eyes. Not trying to be, cheesy or anything, but I mean, it really is. Just to be for real. I mean, he lives on Elm Street, and thanks to these incredible films, he lives on in the hearts and the nightmares of fans like me. So this isn't just a review of the franchise. It is a love letter. This is my own personal love letter to the nightmare that shaped a generation and certainly shaped this fan, starting from the tender age of 3 years old. So yeah. this franchise is just a true masterpiece of modern mythology. Um, so yeah, so I will probably do more videos in the future because, like I said, I love this franchise so much. I'll probably do more videos, going more in depth about the films at a later time. Even maybe go into showing off some of my personal collection of stuff from the franchise. Um, so yeah, but I just figured I would do this for this video, just to kind of just celebrate. Like I said, it goes hand in hand with the Friday the 13th franchise, which is what I'm about to talk about now because this is the main event. Because today is Friday the 13th, June 13th, 2025. This is Jason's birthday. So, I mean, of course, I'm not going to talk about the Nightmare on Elm Street films on Friday the 13th and leave out the Friday the 13th franchise. I mean, because that is why this is the main event. This is my favorite horror franchise of all time. And, where do I even begin to kind of talk about this love affair that spans decades with me with the Friday the 13th franchise? And it's just this is not just a series, of horror movies, but is this kind of blood soaked vein, right running through my veins, just run straight to that heart of modern pop culture, and just more importantly, my own life. So. Just like how I said, Nightmare on Elm Street, that franchise was important to me, how it's important to my life. This one goes a step beyond that with Friday the 13th. So, this is much like how I just gave my personal love letter to the Nightmare franchise. This is also going to be my love letter to the enduring power of Camp Crystal Lake. That chilling symphony of Harry Manfredini's score, just that quiet, relentless, machete wielding son of a bitch that is a force of nature that is Jason Voorhees. So, my journey with Jason and the whole Friday the 13th legacy started very early as well. Not as early as I did with Nightmare on Elm Street, but it was around that same time. I was about 4 or 5 years old. And I remember watching these for the first time on TV because back then when I was a kid, they don't do this now because of TV, cable TV is not really a thing anymore. Everybody's kind of switched to streaming nowadays. But back when I was a kid in the early 90s, they would always show the Friday the 13th movies all the time when it was Friday the 13th. And I remember like in the mid 90s, like 96, when like I first, found out who Joe Bob Briggs was and was watching Monster Vision. I remember them doing like an all nighter thing where they showed a ton of the Friday the 13th films on Monster Vision. Um, so and much like Freddy Krueger, like this was Jason Voorhees was another name that kids were talking about at school, on the playgrounds, and just and a lot of that whole thing with the merchandise and stuff. It was everywhere as well, just as much as the Nightmare on Elm Street stuff was. So my knowledge at that age, when I was very young, when I started watching these films, um, it really wasn't from watching all of the films directly at that age, but again, like my parents, my brother, some of my friends, cousins, they were all responsible for this, about turning me on to those films as well as like the Nightmare on Elm Street films. Um, so much like the Nightmare on Elm Street films and Freddy Krueger, Friday the 13th and Jason Voorhees became this kind of osmosis of pop culture, in the 80s and the 90s as well. Jason, just like Freddy, was everywhere. On Halloween decorations, on VHS covers and posters, and uh, you know, uh, stuff that my friends or my cousins had at their houses, or stuff that my brother had. He was referenced in cartoons. There's just there were comic books of him as well, just all kinds of stuff. So like Freddie and Jason were like the two huge horror icons of the 80s and the 90s. Um, and just, even without seeing all the violence, like I said, I first watched these movies on TV, so some of the stuff was cut, in the edited versions on TV. Um, just the whole image was just it stuck with me. The hockey mask, just the name Jason Voorhees itself. It was just kind of simultaneously terrifying and captivating. A just this forbidden fruit that my young mind instantly knew was significant. Um, he became, another boogeyman that I wanted to know more about. Um, this early, almost kind of mythological awareness really laid the groundwork for that deep fandom that would blossom as I got older, and could finally delve into the actual films and other horror films out there. Um, and just what a journey it has been since I was such a young kid. Being a fan of these films, starting with the original 8 Paramount films, which it felt like discovering ancient blood drenched history or something. You know what I mean? Like, so if you start with the first Friday the 13th from 1980, um, and it almost feels sacrilegious. I know that sounds weird, but it almost feels sacrilegious to start, talk about these, films that's, you know, going to primarily be focused on Jason Voorhees, um, when Jason Voorhees isn't really even in the original film until like, the very last scene. Um, but, ex- the original Friday 13th is just a masterpiece in atmosphere and suspense. It might be, a product of its time with kind of some dated elements, but the dread it builds, the isolated setting of Camp Crystal Lake, the gruesome practical effects and the kills. Thanks Tom Savini. Um, it really established the DNA of what this franchise would become. The it just that the twist ending, revealing Pamela Voorhees as the killer, seeking revenge for her son, is just iconic and was genuinely shocking for that time. I can't imagine because I wasn't born until '86, but I can't imagine being a teenager and going to see this film in 1980 and just what that would feel like in the movie theater, seeing that for the first time, and just all of that being revealed to you right then and there. Um, it just it's crazy. Like I believe my mother-in-law actually told me that she went and seen it um, when the film came out back in 1980. But like I don't think she really thinks much of it. I don't think she's really ever been much of a horror fan. I mean, but she actually watches horror movies, though. That's something I can't say my own mom even does. But yeah, my mother-in-law, she will watch horror movies from time to time, but she doesn't. This is not typically what you would call a big fan of them. um, but just the whole tragic origin story, that's with the original film. That seed that's planted in to the ground from which Jason would, inevitably rise. You can't appreciate, the unstoppable force without understanding that kind of grieving mother who unleashed the initial terror. So I love the original Friday the 13th, and one of my favorite things about it is like that 10-minute long battle between Alice and Mrs. Voorhees, and which ends, in the decapitation of Mrs. Voorhees. But now we move on to the second film, and these were the second film in Friday the 13th Part 2. These were the first steps of the iconic Jason Voorhees. So this is where our boy, he truly enters the picture. So Friday the 13th Part 2 introduced Jason Voorhees, um, even though it was with a sack over his head. And you know what? That works. Like this is, and I love that look. I mean, even though the hockey mask and everything is iconic, that's what the most fans will think of when they think of Jason Voorhees. That's how he's mostly recognized. I love the tater sack Jason look. I love that this it was a terrifying look that would also be used in films like the Town That Dreaded Sundown. It's just a very creepy, unsettling, look. Now it implies that something horrific is underneath. Um, and just this film really establishes, the key Jason traits, his resilience, his connection to his mother's shrine, his relentless pursuit of, these kids who are trespassing on his territory and doing drugs and having sex. And it's just it's more of a traditional slasher than the first film, because this one really ramps up the body count, performs that kind of formula that would end up defining the series. So, kind of seeing Jason move in this, seeing him stalk people, seeing him kind of begin this reign of terror. It was everything that my young horror hungry mind craved at the time, and it's definitely one of my favorites of the franchise. Um, but moving on now to part three. So the mask is born in this one with because of the character Shelley who uh, brings the mask with him and that Jason ends up taking from him. But so with in part two, which was basically Jason's birth into the franchise, unless you count those 5 seconds with Ari Lehman as the young Jason at the original. But part three was more like, his baptism by fire, or, rather by machete and hockey mask, if you will. Um, so this film is, I think, arguably one of the most crucial in the entire franchise. Not necessarily for its plot or the acting, but because it gave Jason his permanent recognized look that's known all over the world. And that moment that he finds that discarded, hockey mask, puts it on, is just pure cinematic lightning in a bottle. It's simple, it's chilling, it's instantly iconic. And then this is another horror film where they did try the 3D elements on, and they were pretty cheesy, even back then. Um, but it just adds that another layer of fun to it, just kind of making the kills pop, out to the audience and literally off the screen. Um, and from this point on, Jason was the hockey mask, and that hockey mask was Jason. They defined each other. This this film it solidified, his kind of visual identity in a way, few horror characters ever achieve. Um, and then, moving on to the next one, part four, the final chapter, which, yeah, right, the final chapter, which it was supposed to be. Like, back when the film was made, it was supposed to be, and that's why they convinced Tom Savini to come back, because, he did the effects on the original film, so he wanted to be the one that would end up killing Jason by doing the effects when they kill Jason in this film. But as we all know at this point now, this was not the last Friday the 13th film. Um, but the final chapter is often cited as a high point in the franchise. And I think it's definitely another one of my top favorites. Um, and it's I think it's easy to see why. It brought back Tom Savini again, for just some that truly gnarly effects work. And it introduced this fantastic character of Tommy Jarvis, which we would end up having a whole trilogy of Friday the 13th films, with Tommy Jarvis as the protagonist. But this one introduced him, with Corey Feldman playing Tommy Jarvis in this one, and this delivered on the promise of more classic Jason mayhem. This film features some incredibly memorable kills and chase scenes, and excuse me, sorry. But Jason feels particularly menacing here. Sorry, I didn't mean to burp in everyone's ear there. Um, but um, but yeah, he's just it's like Jason is just like a force of nature that's closing in, and then like I said, that character of Tommy really adds a very unique dynamic. This kid who uses his horror knowledge to survive, and he was seen as kind of like a version of Tom Savini, because the character of Tommy Jarvis is into like horror, and he's into makeup effects, and he has like the little puppet and stuff different things that he make, the mask. Um it's just the whole film just feels like this kind of a culmination of the human, slash undead Jason era before the series shifts gears. And I absolutely love it, so much about it, to talk about, but I'm just trying to kind of like go through this quickly because there are a lot more Friday the 13th films to talk about than there is Nightmare films. Um, but I want to move on now to the next film, part 5, A New Beginning, which a lot of people look at as the black sheep of the franchise, but this is my absolute favorite Friday the 13th film. And like I said, I know it's controversial among fans, because it doesn't feature Jason Voorhees as the killer. It's an imposter Jason with Roy, the ambulance driver. And, for a lot of fans, if you're not, especially if you're not familiar with the franchise, when you go in, you're expecting Jason and you don't get it. And I can understand how that might be disappointing to some people, but just you know, viewing this through the kind of a lens as a dedicated fan, A New Beginning is just so fascinating and weird and sleazy, and it's just my cup of tea. It leans into that kind of exploitation elements that I also love, and it has some truly bizarre characters like Ethel and Junior. And to me, this has the most interesting cast of characters in any Friday the 13th film. Not, from Ethel and Junior to all these messed up kids at this psychiatric home to, Reggie the Reckless, and his brother Demon, played by Miguel Nunez, and that the whole scene with Miguel Nunez and his girlfriend where he's sitting in the porta potty. He's like, the shit box is gross, and because he didn't go take a shit because he ate all the enchiladas, and then as he's taking a shit, like he's just him and his girlfriend are singing back and forth like ooh baby, ooh baby. I mean, it's so bad that it's great. I mean, and that's what uh, really appeals to me with this film. It makes me love it so much because it just has a sense of humor about it that really goes along with my sense of humor, but it also has that Friday the 13th feel about it. And while Killer isn't Jason, just the influence of Jason is all over the film. It explores that trauma that Jason inflicted, and how within Tommy Jarvis's mind, and how it can breed all these kind of new horrors. It's it's very quirky, it's a slightly off kilter time, but it is just pure, fun for me. And Danny Steinman, who directed this film, um, I mean, you couldn't ask for a better director for this type of film that was presented here. He also did another film that I talked about earlier this year, Savage Streets, and he just kind of, was he defined that whole idea concept of exploitation and sleaziness and horror and those types of films. Um, but it's the very oddness really makes it strangely endearing and rewatchable for me over and over. And it just, one of the biggest reasons why it's became my favorite Friday the 13th film of all time. It's proof to me that the franchise wasn't afraid to experiment, and even if that experiment didn't fully land for everyone, it definitely lands for some of the more dedicated fans to this particular entry, like myself. But moving on now to part 6, Jason Lives. So this is where the franchise starts to kind of embrace the supernatural. This is where it frankly becomes kind of pure, unadulterated fun. So Tommy Jarvis is back again in this. This time he played by Tom Matthews. Um, I didn't mention the actor in part five, but part five he was played by John Shepard, but he's back again. Part six, and Tom Matthews plays Tommy Jarvis, and he's now more grown up, and he's tormented. He accidentally resurrects Jason via lightning bolt with Horshack from Welcome Back, Kotter, who gets immediately killed as Jason is resurrected, and just Jason is just like a genuine zombie in this, and Jason is very self aware, and injects that humor and a kind of meta commentary on the horror genre while still delivering all the expected goods that a Friday the 13th film can bring. Jason is now explicitly undead. He's faster. He's stronger. Just effectively immortal. Um, and the kills in this one are super creative and very darkly comedic. Um, but just the return to a reopened Camp Crystal Lake feels just right with this, and I think this is regarded as a lot of fans of the series this is their favorite of the whole franchise. I believe this is my wife's favorite of the franchise when it comes to the Friday the 13th films. But just this film really does it gets it. It understands what the audience wants, which is this unstoppable supernatural Jason, and it kind of delivers it, with a wink and a smile. It's a blast from start to finish. It has Alice Cooper on the soundtrack. I mean, what else can you ask for? But now going into part seven. So this is part seven, the New Blood, which is basically like Jason versus Carrie. If you look at and I had to start off by saying, that Laura Park Lincoln, who played Tina in this, so she just passed away not that long ago, and while I did get to meet her, it was very brief. It was during a photo op with her, but from the stories I've heard about her, she was just one of the sweetest women you'd ever meet at one of these conventions. And unfortunately, I mean, even though I did meet her, but like I said, it was very brief. It was just kind of like snap photo and you go. If you've ever done a professional photo op at a convention, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But but yeah, just so sad to see her pass away. I know she had her battle with cancer and everything. Unfortunately, she didn't survive that, and I can relate on a personal level there because my aunt who just did pass away a couple weeks ago, she had a long battle with cancer herself, and but just getting back to the film though, like, and I just want to say, this little brief review of part seven is dedicated to the memory of Laura Park Lincoln. But this film, like I said, it's like Jason versus Carrie because Jason, meets these pyrokinetic powers in the New Blood, essentially pitting him against this teenage girl with these telekinetic abilities. And why not? This film gives us, I think, one of the best, gnarliest looks for Jason. And this was the first time that Kane Hodder would play Jason. And I believe he is the only actor to have played Jason more than once. And he would consecutively play Jason in 4 films, starting with part 7. And like I said, he has one of the most gnarliest looks for Jason in this one. His face is revealed from the mask is like broken off the side. His face is all decayed and very horrifying looking. And just the kills are very inventive here, like the sleeping bag kill, which I think is Kane Hodder's you know favorite Jason kill that he's done at least. And while the final battle might not fully live up to the potential of the premise due to like studio interference and the rating cuts and everything, just seeing Jason go up against an opponent with supernatural powers is just a very fantastic escalation in the franchise. It takes the already undead Jason and just kind of forces him to contend with something outside the norm, leading to some kind of memorable set pieces. And Part 7 is another special one to me in the franchise. Um, and the next one I want to talk about is, well, before I talk about it, I should say, let me clarify on that. Like, all of the Friday the 13th films are special to me in their own way. Um, even the much later ones like Jason Goes to Hell and Jason X, I love those films as well. And I love those films more than I like Nightmare on Elm Street Part 5. So, when it came to the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, there's that one film there that really kind of like stands out that I'm not that big of a fan of. But when it comes to the Friday the 13th films, I don't really have any film in the franchise that stands out that I don't necessarily care for. I love all of them in their own way. And I think that's why the Friday the 13th franchise is so special to me, and why it's my favorite of all of the horror in all the horror genre. Um, but moving on back now, what I was saying, on to part 8, which is Jason Takes Manhattan. Um, I love the look of Jason in this one. I love the mask. I love the whole atmosphere. And this is one that a lot of Friday the 13th fans will regard as one of the lesser loved films in the franchise. But guys, I absolutely love Jason Takes Manhattan. I think, even though most of the film takes place on a boat, but when he does get to Manhattan, I think we get some of the most genuinely iconic moments with Jason in Times Square. Jason punching VC Dupree's head off. Jason just finally, submerged in this toxic waste. Um, I mean, yeah, the logic is kind of stretched thin with this one, and it kind of suffers, from some budget constraints, but just that sheer, ambition of taking Jason out of the woods and into, onto a boat and then into New York City is just, it really feels like this kind of grand adventure for our killer. And even though it's got its flaws, it definitely just it has that late 80s, early 90s grimy charm about it. And just seeing Jason, navigate these kind of urban environments really present, or provide this kind of fun change, a pace to the franchise. Um, but now moving on to Jason Goes to Hell. So Jason Goes to Hell, or otherwise known as the Final Friday. Um, okay, this one is probably another that's really divisive, amongst fans. This may be the most divisive film in the franchise, but again, like I said, I have a love for every one of the Friday the 13th films. They're all special to me in their own way. Um, but with this one, I mean, it does have some. I mean, it it's one of my least favorites. I'll say that, but it is still a favorite. Even though it's one of my least favorites, it is still a favorite to me. Because with this one, it introduces all these kind of body hopping worms and this kind of convoluted mythology about a demonic entity, and yes, it's very weird and it strays far from the slasher formula. Um, but just from a fan's perspective of that, you have to appreciate the audacity that this film brought. They tried something wildly different. The practical effects by K&B are outstanding here. Giving us grotesque transformations and just a memorable final showdown. It also includes that infamous, scene at the end with Freddy Krueger, the tease of Freddy Krueger where um, his glove and his claw comes out and grabs the Jason mask and drags it back down to hell. And it was really cool when I found out years ago that because Kane Hodder plays Jason again in this one, and the Freddy Krueger arm that comes out and grabs the mask, that's actually Kane Hodder's arm as well. So I just think that was really cool, and that's probably one of the absolute best moments in the film. And everyone that I've ever talked to that watched that movie when it first came out, in the '90s, uh, like everybody popped for that when the Freddy Krueger arm comes out, and it's kind of because it's teasing something that that for a moment that fans had dreamed about for years for these two I these two horror icons to just finally meet and take on one another. So, after that happened, after Jason Goes to Hell comes out, a lot of people were expecting a Freddy versus Jason film, and it had been just something that had been talks for years, and there was a lot of like legal trouble with all that. But we'll get into it just a little bit. But still talking about Jason Goes to Hell, while it was not the traditional Friday the 13th, it's still this wild, gory, fascinating footnote in the saga. Just a genuine attempt to expand the lore, and just kind of giving us that tease as well. I mean, that's one of the things that a lot of people will talk about when it comes to this film is that tease of like Freddy and Jason finally going to battle against one another. Um, and like I said, that was what people expected after this film came out. It's like, okay, we're finally gonna get a Freddy versus Jason film. That's gonna be the next film. Fortunately, it wasn't. So, like I said, there was a lot of legal, problems with that, bringing that film to the forefront. Um, but next we got Jason X, and this is basically Jason in space. You know, um, so Jason X fully embraces the so ridiculous. It's awesome. Philosophy, and so Jason is frozen. He awakens in the future on this spaceship, and it's just pure sci-fi B movie cheese, and it works because it doesn't take itself seriously for a second. We get Uber Jason, holographic kill simulations, and just a creative future tech deaths. This film is a celebration of the character's indestructibility, and that franchise's ability to kind of reinvent itself in this most absurd uh, absurd way possible. And it's just a movie that was made for the fans who appreciate that kind of inherent silliness, that's seen in so many slasher films, alongside the gore. It delivers exactly what its premise promises, and that's Jason Voorhees killing people in space. And I know a lot of people shit on this one too, but I love Jason X. I think Jason X is so fun. I mean, really, what more could you ask for? And it has one of the most awesome deaths, or awesome kills by Jason in the entire franchise when he like freezes the chick's face and just like busts it on the countertop. That's one of my absolute favorite Jason kills. But now we come to the last film that I'm going to be talking about tonight, and that's Freddy versus Jason, which is this is the dream match that fans wanted this for years. I mean, there was years of speculation, years of talking about this stuff on the internet, the fan art, and just the kids at school, like the playground debates, culminated all together in with this film, and I remember going to actually seeing this film in the theater a few different times, and just watching it with. Yeah, and I think this was the first um, film with Jason or Freddy in it that I ever saw in a movie theater, and just getting to watch that in the theater with other fans that grew up with both of those franchises, and just finally witnessing this dream match. It really felt like this kind of momentous occasion. Freddy versus Jason delivered on the promise of the ultimate slasher showdown. Just seeing these two titans of horror finally share the screen, trading blows with one another, and the body counts. Everything about this film is incredibly satisfying to me. Um, the film manages to balance both character styles and mythologies, giving them motivations that bring them into the conflict. The whole fight choreography is brutal and entertaining here. It's a fan service extravaganza that successfully brought two major franchises, two of the biggest horror franchises in history, together finally for a violent, fun, and memorable time. Um, it was just that cross, like I said, that crossover event that fans had begged for, and it largely delivered. And the only thing that I can say about this negatively is just after hearing Kane Hodder talk about it and how important it was for so many years to be a part of a Freddy versus Jason film. And he even played Freddy's arm at the end of Jason Goes to Hell. He wanted this just as bad and be a part of it just as much as we wanted, us the fans wanted this film to happen. And just and he really like lobbied himself to be Jason in the film when it was when they finally had it put together. But when they made that decision to go with Ken Kersinger as Jason, it really broke Kane Hodder's heart, and it breaks my heart hearing him talk about it, like, because so that's the only negative thing I can take away from Freddy versus Jason. And yeah, just really wish Kane Hodder would have got his dream to be a part of that film. But that's it for all the films that I'm talking about for tonight. But moving even further with just the Friday the 13th franchise and the pop culture rise and just that enduring legacy that the film brought, or that these films brought, you know, just beyond the films themselves, just the Friday the 13th franchise, specifically Jason Voorhees, just much like Freddy Krueger and the Nightmare on Elm Street series, exploded, exploded into that stratosphere of pop culture. Just from Jason's ascent from this tater sack headed killer to a hockey mask, icon is remarkable. I mean, just the series refined that slasher formula, which was introduced by films like Black Christmas and Halloween and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and just they really and it introduced these elements like the isolated camp setting, which I'm a huge mark for like camp movies in general. So just that's another reason why I love the Friday the 13th franchise so much is because of that whole camp setting. Stuff in like Sleepaway Camp, and I like even non-horror movies like Camp Nowhere or Heavyweights. And I'll get into that here in a few weeks. I'm going to be doing some camp related movies. So, Ernest Goes to Camp. There's going to be a lot of fun stuff I'll be covering for the rest of this year. So just stay tuned. But just getting back to what I was saying, just like all these elements that was introduced, with this franchise, the high victim count, the unstoppable mass killer theme that the others would emulate, following the release of the early Friday the 13th films. And just while critics often dismiss these films, audiences devoured them. Just they were drawn to that suspense and the gore and just that primal fear of this, relentless silent stalker. Oh, Brand, you said that I should cover Bloody, Bloody Bible. I think I remember you telling me about this movie. We need to talk about that. So if I do that movie, if I do review it at some time here on the channel, I'm gonna need you to be on that stream with me. Um, but so let's talk about that later, and let's make that happen. Um, but the franchise itself, and Jason Voorhees in particular, just really transcended the genre. His design, is one of the most recognizable in all of fiction. You put a hockey mask on anything, and people instantly think of Jason Voorhees. He represents this kind of primal fear, like I said, the consequence of past sins, that inescapable nature of vengeance, just a force of nature in human form. He's not complex. He's not eloquent. He's just pure, simple engine of destruction, and that simplicity is just terrifyingly effective. Um, he became this kind of shorthand for this unfeeling, unstoppable killer in a way that few characters ever have. His name is just synonymous with the entire horror genre. He's recognized globally by people who have never even seen a single film in the Friday the 13th franchise. But my kid, I'll use my kid example, Noah, when he was just like 3 or 4 years old, I had not told him who Freddy Krueger or Jason was. I had not told him what those films were. I never mentioned it because, that was just an agreement that me and my wife made early on when we first had a child that, we were not going to, overexpose them. Even though me and her are big horror fans, we weren't going to overexpose our child at a very early age to the genre until we felt like he was old enough to kind of, understand. Um, but just thanks to the internet and everything, because my kid was 3, 4 years old, something like that, and he was already like, on tablets and phones and stuff, looking at the internet, and he knew who Freddy Krueger was. He knew who Jason Voorhees was because, both of those characters are just two of the most iconic names in pop culture, not just horror, but in pop culture. And I feel like, both of those characters is just a testament to the power of you know just like the mask and with Jason Voorhees or the glove, the clawed glove with Freddy Krueger, and just that whole brutal mythology that's built around both of those characters. But as I talked about the merchandise and the whole that whole connection with pop culture with Freddy Krueger and Nightmare on Elm Street, same can be said, with Friday the 13th, and it's a huge part of being a Friday the 13th fan for me, and I think countless other fans out there is the merchandise. This that the sheer volume of and variety of stuff. Like I said, just like with Nightmare on Elm Street and Freddy Krueger, this there all the stuff that was made, anything you could possibly think of will have that name on it of Friday the 13th. And from the moment I could scrape together money as a kid, just like with the Nightmare on Elm Street stuff, I was always looking for Friday the 13th stuff as well. I was looking for anything I could find Jason Voorhees related. Whether it be toys, whether it be like, a shirt or whatever, whatever I could find, and just, and that's continued to this day. Not with just the Nightmare on Elm Street stuff, but the Friday the 13th stuff as well. From companies like NECA and Mezco and all these, t-shirt companies like Fright Rags, Cavity Colors, and just so much stuff out there. I mean, it when it comes, I feel like that is just a cornerstone of being a serious fan. And just from owning a figure from a specific film, or capturing a particular look of Jason, whether it be like the Sackhead or Part 3 Mask or Part 7 like zombie look, or the Uber Jason from Jason X. It feels like, for a fan, it feels like owning a piece of the movie itself at times. You know what I mean? Like, the stuff sits on our shelves, and just, we pose like the figures, or whatever, however you want to display your stuff as a fan. They're all just constant reminders, of the films that we love. And, going back to the masks though, like all the masks, that are in the franchise and how they differ from film to film. And if you own a replica hockey mask, whether it's a cheap Halloween prop or it's one of these very painstakingly recreated prop replicas, it's essential as a fan, of the Friday the 13th franchise. Whether you're putting it on, even if you're just messing around, it connects you directly to that iconic Jason Voorhees character. And if you're going to do a Halloween costume, I think, if you're a fan of, you've at some point in your life dressed up as Jason Voorhees, whether it be on Halloween or if you're just messing around at home. Um, and just, I feel like it's incomplete if you don't do that as a fan of Friday the 13th. And like I mentioned earlier with Nightmare on Elm Street having the video game for NES, there was an NES game for Friday the 13th. And, you know, it was notoriously, difficult and weird. And it's just a very nostalgic, touchstone. And more recently, which it's now defunct, they finally like the servers are no more, but they had a Friday the 13th the game out for the more modern platforms, and it finally allowed fans to step into the shoes of counselors or play as Jason Voorhees. So, stalking players, setting traps, using different kill animations, from the movies. It was his ultimate fan service, in game form, and just and just which is a much different, rendition of the NES game of Friday the 13th. Um, but just it was just this premise that kind of fostered, this massive community, and to develop, and it just kind of like developed the Friday the 13th community even more, because there are a lot of people that played that Friday the 13th game had probably never even seen one of the movies or didn't really know anything about Jason Voorhees or the lore or anything, but it brought more interest to the franchise, and just beyond figures and games, there's comics, posters, t-shirts, board games, you know, convention appearances by so many different Friday the 13th cast members, and conventions is a big part of my life. So, and I've met several of these cast members throughout the years for the past, what is it, like 16, 17 years or whatever. I've been going to conventions now. I remember one of the very earliest for me was Kane Hodder, and meeting him for the first time, even though I've met him multiple times now, but meeting him for the first time was just so surreal to me. And the same thing, I didn't mention this when I was talking about the Nightmare on Elm Street films, but the same thing with the Nightmare on Elm Street cast members that I've met at conventions, especially Robert Englund. Like, I've met Robert Englund about 3 or 4 different times now, but every time, like, I get so nervous around it because the dude is such a legend. He's such a legend. I mean, he was Freddy Krueger. Even though there's many different guys that played Jason Voorhees, um, Freddy and Robert Englund were one and the same. You know what I mean? Like, and we don't talk about Jackie Earl Haley or that shitty remake of Nightmare on Elm Street. Robert Englund is Freddy Krueger. And to a lot of people, when it comes to the Friday the 13th franchise, Kane Hodder is Jason because he did play 4 consecutive times, and he at least played him more than once, and that was no other person that played Jason Voorhees could say that. But just aside from all that, just that whole tangible world of merchandise, it isn't just commerce. It's how fans express their identity, connect with the franchise on a physical level and just keep that legacy alive between, the fans and the films. And it shows that Jason isn't just a character on screen. He's this cultural phenomenon that you can collect, display, and interact with. Um, so, overall, while the deep, unwavering love for a series is often dismissed as lowbrow from, repetitive, slasher fare, you know, I don't get that. I don't understand because it's more than that. The Friday the 13th franchise, despite its kind of inconsistencies and creative swings, it's built on this foundation of just effective horror themes, iconic imagery, and just a this surprise amount of heart, a dark, twisted heart, but heart nonetheless. And then Camp Crystal Lake is one of horror's most enduring locations. It's as recognizable as Elm Street or the Myers house. And Harry Manfredini's that whole score is just instantly panic-inducing code for impending doom. Just the practical effects, especially in the early films, and Jason Goes to Hell are often just gruesome works of art. And then, coming back to Jason Voorhees himself, he's not just a monster. He is a tragic figure turned vengeful spirit turned undead force of nature. His motivation, born from this mother's grief and his own, perceived drowning. He It gives him this kind of twisted sense of purpose. I know that sounds strange, but he's the ultimate underdog, or who came back stronger, and this silent, unstoppable force, against sex and drugs and partying and trespassing and just whatever that he saw fit to kill these these young kids over. He is quite simply one of the most effective and enduring horror villains ever created. He's scary because he doesn't talk. He doesn't reason with you. He doesn't feel pain, at least not in his later forms. At least, um, he just comes after you, man. That relentless, silent pursuit is just primal terror. And the Friday the 13th franchise in its entirety, even the weird ones, and even Jason X. And I know as much as some people dislike Jason X, I love it. All of it just represents this significant chunk of horror history, and really this major force in shaping pop culture. And it just it gave us this immortal icon, and it's countless memorable kills in a setting that still you know sends chills down the spine for some people. For me, it's not just a series of movies. It's this comfort blanket of gore and nostalgia, and just this thing that I grew up since I was very young, 4 or 5 years old. I'll be 39 this year. So I mean that's a long it's like that's over 30 years. That's over 30 years I've been a fan of not only just Friday the 13th franchise, but the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise as well. And it's just that kind of forbidden thrill of, childhood turned into this lifelong appreciation for horror and just that whole cultural impact that it brings. And it's the reason that, this stuff will be iconic with not just myself, but just the whole horror community forever. Um, and despite all the legal battles and everything, and that's going to keep Jason dormant for now, even though there is, they are doing finally a new TV series. But Jason Voorhees and that whole spirit of Camp Crystal Lake are immortal in my eyes. Just the mask is too deep in the consciousness of the world. The character is too beloved by fans. So we've been waiting patiently. We're finally going to get some kind of new project. Don't know how it's going to turn out, but like I said, we have been patient for years for this, for the day that Jason Voorhees inevitably returns. And because you can't kill Jason Voorhees, and you certainly can't kill the love that fans have for Friday the 13th. It's more than a franchise. It is family to us fans. It's a very dysfunctional, blood-soaked family, but family nonetheless. And I wouldn't have it any other way. And guys, this has been a blast. This has probably been one of my favorite episodes that I've done thus far here on the channel. And you know, just to do this on Friday the 13th, on June the 13th, Jason Voorhees' birthday. And I don't think the next Friday the 13th that lands on June 13th isn't until like 2030 something. So I hope you guys had a wonderful Friday the 13th. I hope you guys didn't have any bad stuff happen to you on this day. At least you're alive. You weren't killed by Jason Voorhees. So you're here if you're here watching this video. Um, but I hope you enjoyed celebrating Jason's birthday. I hope you enjoyed me celebrating the Nightmare on Elm Street series as well. So, like I said, when it comes to me and it comes to my introductions to horror, those were the two franchises that I was introduced to first and foremost, and the ones I fell in love with the most, or as a young kid. And you just can't go one without the other. Jason Voorhees and Freddy Krueger are like bread, peanut butter and jelly, and they are the two most iconic horror slashers in history, in my opinion. And so it's just I really enjoyed talking about those. Just my little love letter to both of those franchises. If you watch this video, I hope you guys enjoyed this whole tribute to those franchises. I appreciate all of you guys for checking it out. Even whether you're watching this live or you're watching this here on the replay, just want to thank all of you guys for even taking the time to check this out here on this Friday the 13th. And if you love these movies just as much as I do, drop me a comment below what your favorite Nightmare on Elm Street film is. What's your favorite Friday the 13th film? What's your favorite kill from those two franchises? Just what made you fall in love with those films? And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. I'd really appreciate that. If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button to catch more videos from me like this one. So I'll have another video coming this Sunday for Father's Day. We'll be doing a little Father's Day special, talking about a few movies, and then got some other stuff coming up in the next few weeks. That's going to be really fun. I'm still working on, so definitely check those out if you guys have the time. And click that bell for any kind of future notifications as well. But I guess that's it for me tonight, guys. Again, thank you for checking this out. Thank you for checking out the channel in general. And with all that said, I'm Crater. This is CraterMania. I love you guys. Have a good night.